Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Super Coach Mates. Well, we are finally here the last Saturday in September, and we have got two interstate teams, one of which is probably no surprise given the year they've had, and the other one is probably a bit surprising given where they finished, but they've done well to get there. So what we're going to do today is we're just going to quickly go through our thoughts on the grand final. I'm going to provide some of the stats that matter for grand final day that we've been talking about throughout the finals, and just sort of the data that supports that. And then um, we're going to have a quick chat about some other things. So I'm joined by Thomas as per normal. How are you, Thomas? How's your week been so far?
Yeah, not too bad. Had a bit of a breather from work for a couple of weeks, which is nice. But had sat down. Obviously, we had a bit of the saw a bit of the Brownlow on stream and obviously off stream as well. And we spoke off air as well with how surprised we were with regards to Cripps getting 45 votes and even Dacos breaking the record and not even winning the thing. So
Yes.
that's kind of a discussion for another day with regards to how it's run and whether the umpires actually deserve or not deserve, but should actually be the ones voting for it. Because at the end of the day, you look at what happened in that Brownlow count and it's a bit questionable with some of those decisions made. But that's obviously for another day. But moving on to obviously the big dance on Saturday Arvo at the regular slot at 2:30 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon. Big grand final. The last time these sides met, Brisbane, Sydney, I think was around 19, I'm pretty sure. And the Lions
Yep.
actually got the Swannies by 2 points. So by all no means, this could be a very close game in particular. Before we go into a deep dive of your stats, Nathan, what is your initial thoughts based kind of off face value without looking into too much detail as we're going to go into throughout this episode? But on face value, who's your tip and by how much?
Yeah, so face value, my tip is the Sydney Swans. I just think they've been the best team all year. And I just feel like with the week off, they might be a bit fresher. And historically, sides who have to travel twice in a row and come back like Brisbane have generally um, fall off a cliff in the third game. It just gets too tough and too tired to to run out that third game after, basically putting everything on the line in the two games. So we saw this with the Giants in 2019, that they did so well to get to the grand final, but unfortunately, they just ran out of steam after quarter time of that grand final. And where Richmond ran away with it. So yeah, on face value, I am going to go with the Swans. Have been the best team all year.
Yeah.
That's basically on face value where I'm leaning towards.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, I've obviously been, I've said this in previous episodes about I've had a soft spot for the Lions in the last couple of weeks. I've jumped on that bandwagon for the last kind of fortnight or so. I think it'll be a close game regardless. I can't see either team blowing each other out of the park. I mean, Swans historically start quite well, then taper off and have patches where they fall apart. Whereas Brisbane's the opposite; they start really slow and then get on fire real quick towards the end of games. But it seems like Fagan's really nailed it out with how his team wants to run, and he absolutely torched Geelong apart after half time. So I think I'm going to go out on a limb here and say the Lions by under a kick. And I reckon this will be a close granny. I don't think it'll be a blowout, but realistically speaking, probably Swannies are the favourite. They've had the easiest run to the grand final and they had a very easy prelim. But I think, and we'll have this discussion later on, but whether it's one too many finals for Brisbane to back up and play. Like they obviously played against the Cats, won that by a whisker, and then obviously against the Giants and having to
The
do all that
Giants,
work
yep.
by 40 odd points is a tough ask as well. So doing it again and backing up at the G, where they're traditionally not the best at, is yet to be seen. But definitely it'd be a really good final. I think being a neutral ground for both teams as well makes it an enticing contest for sure, and no biases with regards to either side. But Nathan, obviously you've been pretty hot on your stats and pretty nailed on with those stats. What are the stats looking like game?
Yeah, so I just want to really, really quickly go back over all of them again, because this is what we've basically been building up to throughout the finals, and I've got the records for each of the 8 finals as well, and sort of how they stack up. So the 5 stats that we've been tracking are contested possession. So on grand final day, so 9 of the last 11 premiers have 1 contested possession on grand final day. And this year, 4 of the 8 winners have 1 contested possession, so that's slightly down. Clearances, so that's just a raw plus minus differential. So 7 of the 11 premiers have won that battle on grand final day. And this year's finals, it's 6 from 8. The inside 50 differential, so obviously how many inside 50s your team has versus the opposition. All 11 premiers have won that battle on grand final day, and this year in the finals it's 7 from 8, with the outlier being the Geelong Cats just on Saturday. The scores from clearance, so basically anytime your team scores where the starting point was a stoppage, whether it be a ball up, a centre bounce, a throw in, all of that is scores from clearances. So 6 from 11, and this year, this final series so far, it's been 3 from 8. And then the scores from turnover, which is basically when the opposition either give the ball back to you or you just, out system them. The system turns the ball over and then you go back down the other end and score. So all 11 premiers have won that on grand final day. And then this year in the final series, all 8 winners as well have won the turnover battle. So to basically put that in summary, the way the grand finals generally work is the team that wins clearance generally has the upper hand because they generally have territory, which is a big reason as to why the inside 50s and the scores from especially that inside 50 stacks up on grand final day, because on the day it's chaos, and generally you just want to get the ball forward and let the system behind you turn the ball back over to go forward. So generally grand final days work where your clearance game gets you the territory, and then the turnover game gets you the scores. So that's generally how it works on grand final day. And this is supported because 12 of the last 15 grand finals have been a chaos game. So again, the chaos versus control game. So 12 of the last 15, and in 2 of those, it was a chaos grand final, and then the other sides basically just blew them out of the water, and it became sort of a bit of a, keepings off, celebratory thing. So there wasn't really that sort of grand ball stuff. So based on that, you would probably think that the grand final is probably going to be a chaos game based on that. But interestingly, both of these sides actually prefer playing the control game. So they prefer taking marks over, or they've taken more marks on average this year than they've won grand balls in each of the games. So even though the grand finals historically are chaos, high pressure, the fact that both of these teams play a control model tells me that perhaps it might be a bit more cagey, and there might be a lot more keeping off than perhaps historically a lot of other grand finals have been. So again, if we just go through those 5 stats on and compare them what the two sides have done across the season. Interestingly, Brisbane actually lead all of the stats except for the scores from clearance and scores from turnover. So I don't think it's any, I don't think it's going to be a big margin either way. Although, again, we might touch on the Brisbane fatigue factor. So I just think that this is going to be a really, really good game. Sydney have been the best team all year. Basically been out miles in front of everyone. Have sort of been chased down, but they've been good enough to get to the grand final. And then Brisbane, who probably surprised a lot of people by getting to the grand final. But if you actually have a look at their underlying stats, it's probably no big surprise that they're actually here, to be honest with you. And just another interesting thing as well, which historically hasn't happened. So I'm not going to blabber on about the core four stuff, but just interestingly, that historically the better defensive teams have made the grand final. But the last 2 years, the number one team and well, actually, last year I think it was dead even. Last year, no, actually, take that back. So the last 2 years, the number one and number two team with the football, so that's what they do with the ball in hand, have made the grand final, and they haven't had that stronger defensive profiles. Last year, Brisbane and Collingwood were 9 and 11, and this year Sydney and Brisbane are 5 and 6. So they're not at the absolute top when it comes to defense, but what they are top in is what they do with the ball. So I'm just wondering if we're actually starting to see a shift where these defensive systems are actually perhaps not as, they're still important because you still need the turnover game, which when we do our postseason analysis on all of the teams, I will touch on that. But perhaps it's starting to become sort of more what you do when you actually have the ball as opposed to what you do without the ball. That's actually going to be the deciding factor on how you fare across the year. So, hoping for a really, really good game. Obviously, I will be going as a Gold AFL member. So I'm excited to go and watch this game and just see how it unfolds. But yeah, I'm hoping that it's a little bit cooler than last year as well, because last year I think it was 29 and it was absolutely sweating like anything sitting out in the bottom down the open cheering Collingwood home. So as a neutral this year, I'm hoping that it's just a really good game. And yeah, the stats would say it's probably going to be quite an even game, at least on paper.
100% agree. I think these two sides are very deserving of their position in the grand final. I think the one thing that I noticed watching both, they're both quite attacking. It was very clear to me when the Brisbane Geelong game happened that, as soon as Brisbane went through the corridor, Geelong just didn't have any answer with that. And Geelong played the boundary very well with their chip mark kind of slowed down style. But Sydney is in a very similar mould to Brisbane. You just have to look at the way their midfield is set up in Heaney, Warner, Goulden, Rowbottom, the likes of those midfielders are going to stack up very nicely against the Lions. So, yeah, definitely one to watch, and it'll be definitely a good midfield battle, which we'll touch on a bit later. But moving on to the talking points for the granny, as I said, as we both think this is going to be quite close. First off the bat, do you reckon, we'll try and keep these nice and short, otherwise we're going to reach now very quickly, but do you reckon should James Jordan has done his tagging role all season? Do you reckon that he tags Neil or Zorko?
Nah, send him to Zorko. Just straight send him to Zorko.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree. I think Rowbottom probably can do a job on Neil.
The same.
But I think, I mean, we just saw that Carlton paid no respect whatsoever to Zorko in that first final, and Zorko just tore them apart with his elite kicking skills. And then in the second final against the Giants, they sent Peatling to him, and then he just shut down completely. And it wasn't until Connor McKenna came on as a sub, and there was the two running half-backs that they started to build that game up again. But I think if Jordan just goes straight to Zorko, gives him hell, and really tries to get under his skin, I think that's going to be a one-way ticket to the Swans winning. Question 2, how do you think the Lions cover the McInerney loss? There's obviously been news that Darcy Ford is a likely replacement, but do you reckon there's obviously Fort's a pretty good ruckman in itself for a replacement, but do you reckon there is another way that they can cover that McInerney loss, whether it's a midfield, whether it's a forward line, pushing higher up the ground to kind of make sure the Swannies don't get those hit outs to advantages? Because, as likely as it is probably predicted, Grundy might have a field day against Darcy Fort if all things considered on a normal season.
Yeah, well, Brody Grundy's actually not a great tap out ruckman. He does his work mainly around the ground.
Uh-huh.
So normally Grundy sort of just tries to equalise and then get them on the run. So the logical answer is Darcy Ford just to go in there. I can't see Joe Danaher doing the full game in the ruck. I just think he's so important for Brisbane's forward structure. Even though historically and I don't know if we're going to have another segment on this, but I'll just go out now and say that I think the biggest factor in this game is going to be the small forwards. I think whoever team's small forwards can get on top, I think will be the winning team. So I'm looking squarely at guys like Papley, Haywood, Heaney, those guys, and then Bailey, Cameron, Archie, Kai Lohman. Those guys are going to be the ones that win or lose the game. So yes, for Brisbane, just bring Darcy Ford in, just getting to do a negating role on Grundy, and that will perhaps help Sydney with, Brisbane with covering that loss.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. Do you reckon the Lions tag Heaney? Obviously, Jared Berry's one that springs to mind as a person that can be quite physical around the contest. And I know he plays a very important wing role, very similar to a Mason Wood in St Kilda, where he's a bit of a taller wingman, runs all day, but really covers defensively speaking, that intercept mark kind of wing role. Do you reckon they tag Heaney, or is there a kind of situation where you tag Heaney, then the next person gets loose in Warner and they really struggle to contain all of them? Or do you reckon Heaney's a real key linchpin in the Sydney lineup and then they need to tag him ASAP?
No, I'm actually going to say I think you need to tag Chad Warner.
Yeah.
If I'm being honest with you, the only reason I say that is because he has been Sydney's best player across the final series so far, according to the Champion Data player ratings. And on grand final day in 2022, he actually had the third highest rated grand final in recorded history, which probably would surprise a lot of people. So since 2010, when Champion Data started doing the recording, third highest game. His second half was the highest ever half recorded by a player in a grand final, and then his final quarter was the highest ever quarter recorded by a player in a grand final. So that just says to me I would be going after Chad Warner because I think he's the one who's going to rip the game away. And I think he probably more so than Heaney's the one that's going to get them going out of the midfield. So I would probably start on Warner and just try and shut him out and just sort of try and negate Heaney as best as they can. But I don't think they're going to be able to tag all three of them. So I think one of them's going to get off the chain. And if there's one that I'm going to want to get off the chain, it's probably going to be Heaney. Just because I don't think there's a matchup for him in Sydney's forward line. Whereas I think Dunkley goes to Warner,
Yeah.
although he might be a bit on the slower side. And then I think they can find someone to go out to Gordon. Well, I think they need to find someone to go out to Gordon. So I'd be happy to roll the dice on Heaney because of Chad Warner's finals record so far this year and the fact that on grand final day in 2022, despite Sydney losing by 81 points, he was rated as the best player on the ground. I think he's the one you need to go after.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think Warner, as much as Heaney's done so well this season, I think Warner's the one that if you shut him out the game, Sydney start to fall apart a little bit. He loses his confidence and stuff like that. Whereas as Heaney moves forward, I think Starcevic does a pretty good job. Would do a pretty good job against him. Lester can cover him up forward. I think there's players there for the Lions that are very good one-on-one. In the small defensive category, that's of course the tools run of the question. But yeah, I think you're right in the fact that Warner's the one that could really tear the Lions a new one, considering that he probably has the speed on Dunkley and Neil, and the only real player that I think can run with him just physically is Ashcroft, and that's just because of his youthfulness. But Yeah, time will tell on Saturday, that's for sure. But moving on to
You missed
head.
one.
Oh,
You
did
missed
I?
you
Oh,
missed the
sorry.
bottom one. Yeah.
Hang on. Before we head to that one, we obviously spoke about this, and we'll get this one brief, I guess, because we've already touched base on this. But do you reckon? Obviously, the Lions played their first final at home, so there wasn't any problems there. It was a pretty whitewashed affair. But the second game had to fly to Western Sydney. Tough game. Conditions, real contested game, and snuck over the line there. Had to play the quarter of their life to get over the Giants, then travel to Melbourne, have to play the Cats there, do exactly the same thing, sneak over the top at the end, but then having to fly back to Brisbane, recover, and get on a plane back to Melbourne yesterday. Is this one too many matches for the Lions, or do you reckon they've hit form at the right time where fitness and fatigue and all the sports science stuff is thrown out the window? And they're purely playing on emotion, which will get them over the line. Considering, and I mean, this is the same as Sydney, both teams are coming from a losing previous grand final, but considering the Lions, and you would know firsthand, watch them last year in that grand final in Heartbreak City, do you reckon they're playing on emotion, or is it one too many hurdles to cross from a kind of logistical point of view where fatigue comes into play?
Yeah, this is my one worry for this game. So I've just got up the 2019 grand final now, just for reference. So the GWS Giants were in exactly the same boat. So they had their first final at home against the Western Bulldogs, and then they had to travel the last two finals, had two really close finals. And then in the grand final, they kicked the first goal. And then Richmond scored 17 of the next 19 goals after that. And it was game over. I think the Giants just ran out of legs. This is my only worry for this grand final is I just worry about how much longer Brisbane can keep up, because I think it is really dangerous playing grand final day on emotion. I think Craig McRae at Collingwood was really big on playing the moment and not the occasion. So if you're going to rely on emotion, I think it's going to be hard to maintain that for four quarters. So I just feel like with the rest that I think Sydney are primed for this. And yeah, this is my one worry about this game. In saying that, though, the only difference here is that if there's not an MCG side, it's a completely neutral side. Or there's two neutral teams, unlike 2019. So there probably won't be as much of a crowd factor as what there was in 2019 and perhaps last year as well. So, I still, this is my one worry with this game, which is why all the stats saying Brisbane, but I've just got in the back of my mind what happened in 2019 with the Giants. They had to travel twice in a row. You had two really, I guess, really big encounters. And they just unfortunately ran out of legs after quarter time in that grand final. So this is my one worry with Brisbane. So yeah, I just have this in the back of my mind that I'm hoping it's not, but I'm fearful that it is. That's probably how I'll phrase it.
Yeah, no, I do agree with you in that regards, and you're right. And it's GWS are eerily similar with how they went about things, and they got torched against the Tigers. But I guess the difference in that regards, I think, and the one caveat is Sydney aren't a Melbourne side with a huge MCG following, where Richmond basically had a massive home ground advantage, and things like that. And Sydney aren't the best of the G as well, so I think the Lions have that one upper hand. They've played a few more games finals wise at the G, and Swans got absolutely embarrassed the last time they played there against the Cats. So whether there or not there are some mental scars there, the Lions probably come into it thinking they only lost by a few points against the Pies last year in one of the best grand finals in a long time. And yeah, Sydney's mental demons are going to come back strong come Saturday, and it's whether or not John Longmire can use that as fuel rather than a repeat of the 2022 final. But moving on to a couple key matchups, or two in particular that I've taken out of here, and we'll talk about our key players at the back end of the show. But two head-to-head player stats, and I just want your quick opinion on who do you think will get the winning or be the winner out of these two, not necessarily based off the team's performance, but individually speaking, one in the midfield and one in the defence. So kicking off in the midfield, Lockie Neal versus Isaac Heaney. So Neal, these are the Supercoach points you can see here the last time these two sides played. As you can see, both had a little bit disappointing outings. Neal got tagged, 18 disposals, 4 tackles, 6 clearances, no goals, and 1 inside 50. So really shut down his ability to kick the ball inside 50. And he's in that similar, and I keep saying it because I think him, Merritt play very similar. The Lions utilise their Lockie Neal's kicking skills inside 50 to a T. He's a big reason why they get scores on the board, and when he's left alone, he can do that to great effect. And Heaney, on the other hand, he went through a bit of a quiet patch in this particular part of the season. That was kind of evident in his lack of Brownlow votes, as much as the Brownlow votes are a bit questionable. But 19 disposals, 6 tackles, 6 clearances, 2 behinds, 1 inside 50, so it was very slow in that regards. Come Saturday on the big dance, Nath, who do you think comes out on top out of these two players in particular?
Yeah, well, I think if Neal gets on top, I feel like that's probably going to mean that Brisbane are probably going to be right up to this game in their eyeballs. And for Heaney, well, I think it's a simple case for Heaney. I think if he's going to win this, I know they're probably not going to play head to head, but if you're going to put me on the spot here, I think for Heaney, he's got to score. He's got to get on the scoreboard. I think that's where Sydney perhaps have an advantage over Brisbane, is the fact that their midfield can kick goals. We saw in last year's grand final, I think Collingwood kicked, what did they kick? They kicked 12 goals. And 2, 4, 5, 6, 7 of Collingwood's goals came from their midfield. And Brisbane kicked 13, and I think only 3 of them came from the midfield. So if Warner and Goulden and Heaney can all hit the scoreboard, then it's going to be hard to make a case for Brisbane. I think in the midfield, I think Neal would win this matchup just purely head-to-head in the midfield. But I think where Heaney can elevate himself is I think Heaney can hit the scoreboard more than what Neal can. If you're going to give me an option of picking the two, I think I'm just going to lean towards Heaney, just because I feel like Brisbane aren't going to tag Heaney, whereas I feel like the Swans are going to tag Neal. So I'm going to lean towards Heaney just.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you there. The likes of Rowbottom and James Jordan in particular are going to really try and shut down Neal, whether or not whoever starts on him is going to do a job. And I think Heaney is just built for finals. He's a different animal, beast when he comes out and plays the finals. The next in line are the two defenders, which I think are really important for both sides. They utilise these two players effectively and so often. They're a big reason why their inside 50s are on the higher end of things. The last time these two sides played, both players had a pretty good outing. Zorko top scored for the Lions, Supercoach wise, 129 Supercoach points, 29 disposals, 12 of those kicks, 7 rebound 50s, 27 of the 29 were kicks, not 12 marks, 7 rebound 50s and 627 metres gained. So they're huge numbers, and I think if the Swans, which I think historically when Jordan doesn't go to a rebounding defender, the defenders usually do well. So Jordan's a big reason in that. Blakey, you saw it probably firsthand against Port. They used him quite a bit. He just runs like anything, gets the 1-2s. 91 Supercoach points, 18 disposals, 4 marks, 6 rebound 50s, 16 of his 18 are kicks. So he loves to kick the ball. So does Zorko. I mean, they're elite kicks for that reason. 386 metres gained. I think Zorko does a lot of short runs across the back 50, whereas Blakey's basically run and gun forward. Who do you think's a more important player out of these two for their respective sides, and who do you think comes out on top come Saturday?
Yeah, well, I feel like this is going to be the same thing as the one we just did. I feel like Zorko's going to get tagged and Nick Blakey's not going to get tagged. So I think if Nick Blakey can get the ball in the middle, and Sydney can get their game going through the corridor, they're going to win this game comfortably. If Zorko doesn't get tagged, and he can get the ball in the corridor, and Brisbane can get their corridor game going, like we saw in the second half against Geelong, well, they're probably going to win the game. So I think these two players, I would say purely based on ball use, are probably the two most important players on the ground because they get their teams going from halfback, which historically has been a premiership model as well. I think the last three premiers have been number one at scores from the back half, and I think Sydney are number one in that this year. And I would say Blakey's a massive reason why they are number one. So, I just think that Blakey will win this matchup purely because I think he will not get tagged, and I think Zorko will.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I think Zorko really needs to have a big game and try and find ways to negate the tag, whether it is he ends up flipping to half forward and running into the midfield and doing something different to really throw James Jordan off or, handball the James Jordan tag off to Neil. But before we wrap it up, I don't know why these screens aren't working, but just bear with me whilst we do that. I'm going to just remove this. I don't know why it's been playing up all day, but I'm just going to read out the key players whilst I try and fix this up. So the key players I had for the Swannies was Errol Goulden, Chad Warner, and Brodie Grundy. Obviously, the key players would have involved Nick Blakey and Isaac Heaney, but we talked about those, so I decided to pick three others. But yeah, Errol Goulden, Chad Warner, Brodie Grundy. I think, as we touched on before, Errol Goulden and Chad Warner are super important. Goulden provides a lot of the run when Blakey doesn't have the ball and he's an elite kick inside 50. Warner's a match winner. I think he is pretty much the key to the Swans' success with his ability to score, 3 goals and a quarter from centre stoppage. And Grundy, I think he will, it'll be a bit different if McInerney was a late out, but I think Grundy knows now that Fort's pretty much a shoo-in unless they do something drastic on the selection table tomorrow night. What are your thoughts on those three players in particular? Any other Swans players that you think will be key to making this, allowing the Swans to win another premiership?
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think those two, especially Goulden and Warner, are going to have a massive say on this game. I think Brisbane need to be really careful about what they do with those two. I think if they dominate the game like they have just about every game this year, Sydney are going to be nigh on impossible to stop. So, I think those two are probably the two most important players. And I think Grundy, whilst he's not a dominant tap-out ruckman, what he does around the ground, the fact that Darcy Fort's probably one of these more lumbering ruckmen that I think Grundy would consider himself to have an advantage there with with being able to run Fort off the ground. So I think those three are. Obviously you've got Heaney and Blakey as well. I know we've already touched on them, but they're going to have a massive say on this game as well. But yeah, I think the thing with Sydney is they're just such an even team that obviously, the three midfielders have had a massive influence on the games that they've played in, but they're just such an even team that they don't really need any one player to dominate to win games, which is probably a good thing. I feel like that Sydney are primed, they're ready, and I think they will be going into this game probably, saying that they can probably win.
Yeah, no, I do agree in that regards. I think it'd be definitely an interesting proposition. And I think Randy in particular, every time I know, having owned him in Supercoach early days, every time it seems like he's going to dominate opposition, he seems to get ahead of himself. So has a stupid free kick against count, doesn't really capitalize and gets a little bit sucked in because the opposition ruckman's really trying to nullify them because they know they're not going to beat him around the ground. But if Grundy can use his aerobic capacity and you would know firsthand, Nathan, watching Brodie Grundy at Collingwood, if you can use his aerobic capacity, get around the ground, really push Fort, I think, because Fort's not a small ruckman, he's not going to be undersized, that's for sure. But I think if you really push and wear out Darcy Fort and force the Lions to play Danaher more as a ruckman, that's going to push the Swans in a winning edge. But moving on, before we wrap it up, the final three players that I think are going to be key for the Lions. So we flip over to the ruck side of the Lions. Obviously, no McInerney and Darcy Fort there. Obviously, the 0.5 hit-outs to advantage isn't accurate because he's only played a handful of games this season, if any. Hugh McCluggage, I think he just runs all day for the Lions. every time, and having owned him in Supercoach at the back end of this season, every time Lockie Neal and Dunkley have quiet days, McCluggage usually has a day out. Will be key to really trying to match Goulden's capacity around the ground and provide the same kind of penetration inside 50 for the Lions. And Danaher, I think, comes up against, the likes of Tom McCartan. Lewis Melican's probably going to provide support there, but Danaher with his size and brute force really needs to push those two key defenders outside their comfort zone, because I think if he doesn't do that and really ends up getting sucked into the intercept marks of the Swannies, the Lions going to struggle to score. But if he can push high up forward, really try and harass the Sydney defenders, then it'll go a long way for him to kick a winning score. And I think he needs a couple goals for the Lions to win. But is there anyone else that springs to mind, Nathan, of the Lions that you think are going to be really key come Saturday?
Yeah, I think that I touched on this. I think the Brisbane small forwards are going to be pivotal for Brisbane winning this game. So, Bailey, Cameron, Archie, Lohman, I think they're ultimately going to be the deciding factor for Brisbane. If they can hit the scoreboard like they did even in last year's grand final, that's going to go a long way to keeping Brisbane in the game and perhaps putting them in a winning position. And for Joe Danaher, any goals they get out of Danaher and Hipwood are probably a bonus. Just because historically grand final day doesn't bode itself well to to big forwards, key forwards dominating, at least in recent times. McCluggage, I think, is, if there's a player who perhaps goes a bit under the radar, it is McCluggage. Has a great record for Brisbane. I think last year he was one of only, I think, a few players who I think had like 20 disposals, a goal, and I think 10 clearances or something in a final. I think he's only one of 3 players to do that. So his record's really good. And yeah, we've already touched on Darcy Fort. So I think the other key player as well, he's probably not on here, but what it's probably more so from a Sydney perspective, but it is a Brisbane player, and that is, what do they do with Harris Andrews? Because we saw last year that Collingwood tagged Harris Andrews with Billy Frampton. So I just wonder if Amati or McDonald perhaps play more of a decoy role and just stop Harris Andrews from dominating the intercept marks, because again, as we've touched on, all 11 premiers have won the turnover battle on grand final day. So Harris Andrews is a massive factor in Brisbane's turnover game. So negate that. And I think it will go a long way towards Sydney winning. So I would say that Harris Andrews is probably arguably Brisbane's just about their most important player, just purely for that reason. But yeah, I'm happy with all of those.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we haven't really touched on, and I guess we'll touch on this more so when it comes to Supercoach next season, is those young kids for the Lions. I think they play a pivotal role as well. We always say when it comes to football in general, not just grand finals, but just in home and away seasons, that, teams that their bottom 6 aren't up to it, or they're really lacking skill and ability, and they're just there as kind of fill-ins, as much as they're deserved on an AFL list, as they're kind of exposed, and that kind of brings the whole team down in a sense, because you're only good as your kind of bottom 6. But I think the young kids have really stepped up, like your Lomans, Logan Morris, Will Ashcroft coming back from an ACL has been super impressive. So if those young kids for the Lions can step up and prove themselves on the big stage like Lohman did last week, I think that goes a long way for the Lions to bring up that Premiership Cup. But that's all we've got time for today. We've kept it a little bit short. Obviously, there's only one game to review rather than a few more. Hopefully, if you've got somewhere to watch the grand final, whether it is at a pub or at home, I think this will be a really close game. As most grand finals are, that we've obviously seen blowouts like in 2022, but most grand finals in recent years have been really close. And hopefully you enjoy the grand final for the spectacle it is, and just enjoy a game of footy at the end of the day for two teams that really deserve their spot in the grand final. Moving forward, we'll be looking at a bit of a wash up of the teams. Obviously, we did a bit of a mini series starting with some other content creators that was posted earlier this month, sorry, not early this month, the last few months in the back end of the home and away season. I think just with the timing of it all towards the back end of the year and giving us a bit of a breather before the 2025 Supercoach season, we're going to group up these teams together, the ones we haven't covered, and kind of go through each one with their highs and lows of the season, essentially grading them, and then bringing in the players that left the club, come back or are new to the club, or the trade-ins, and tie that in rather than have a standalone video on the trade period. But I think that'll.
And I'm going to do some stats as well for the teams.
Yeah, Nathan statistical stuff we'll bring in as well and push into next year. I think that's really valuable for those of you who do like the statistical side of footy. And those stats can really do help if you're looking at Supercoach from another angle in 2025. But other than that, enjoy the grand final, and we'll catch you probably next Monday for the wash-up.